Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. Your commitment to advancing mental health care is truly inspiring. At Iconotes, we're passionate about providing mental health professionals like you with the most clinically robust and intuitive mental health care software available. From psychiatrists to therapists, nurse practitioners to social workers, Iconotes offers a comprehensive solution tailored to your practice's needs. With Iconotes, you can write a flawless note in less than 3 minutes, and without typing a single word. Iconotes was designed specifically to help mental health professionals write comprehensive notes quickly. Iconotes also provides a complete practice management solution with user-friendly scheduling, secure document management, HIPAA-compliant messaging, a certified patient portal, and more, so you can spend less time on paperwork and more time helping your patients. Try us free at iconotes.com/try-us.
Welcome, everyone. We are so glad you have joined us today. I'm Angela Kostelic. I'm part of the marketing team here at Iconotes, and I'm really excited to bring you this presentation today with our guest speaker, Katie Bendel. And this presentation will be very interesting for me personally, because I think I fall into this category sometimes, especially during the new year. But welcome again. If everyone can just put in the chat where you are joining us from and what your discipline is, that will help Katie know who is here today and how she can speak directly to you based on your discipline. Go ahead and put that in the chat, just so you know that there are presentation slides and a handout in the handout section there. Introducing Katie. She is a therapist, writer, public speaker, and community connector, a seasoned expert in eating disorders, and she brings years of clinical experience and a passion for guiding clinicians through nuanced challenges like orthorexia nervosa. And she has walked alongside thousands of individuals on various journeys, including those seeking eating disorder or substance abuse recovery, and even those learning to cope with mood, anxiety, and trauma-related disorders. And over the last decade, she served in various roles such as individual therapist in the outpatient setting, clinical assessment for higher levels of care, residential program support, aftercare planning, resource development, community education with writing and speaking, and so much more. She is a busy woman. We are so glad that she is here with us today. So thank you, Katie. We're so glad to have you here presenting with us again. So welcome, Katie. I am going to hand over the stage to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Angela. And thank you to Iconotes for having me back. And thank you, everyone, for making time to be here. I see a lot of professionals. I'm looking in the chat from across the US, but I'm also seeing somebody from, I think it was Australia. You said you're here at 3:30 a.m. your time. So my goodness, thank you so much. And I hope this presentation is worth it. That is my goal. I think it will be for you. But welcome, everyone. Angela told you a little bit about me, but just to go into a little bit more detail, I'm a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Texas. I began working at a residential treatment center for eating disorders and substance abuse in 2013. And then I went to school for my master's. I got my master's of social work in 2017, and then went straight into working for a treatment center that offers higher level of care for eating disorders and mood, anxiety, and trauma-related disorders. And so in that setting, we had and have the intensive outpatient level of care all the way up to inpatient. And I've served in different roles throughout my time there. So I come to you from that lens, with kind of a heavy influence of working in higher levels of care. But as Angela mentioned, I've also worked in the outpatient setting. The topic of orthorexia is really complex, I find. And, there's some limited research actually on what we have so far and what we've developed as a field in terms of categorizing it, establishing treatment models, etc. So it's a little dicey topic, but it's also something that makes it exciting to dive into. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, if you don't mind. As an FYI for everyone, I'm not able to control the slides, so Angela's doing it for me. Thank you, Angela. So just our agenda for today. There is so much to this topic, and so we will really just be scratching the surface. And so I just want to remind everyone, this is a starting point. My goal today is to really offer just a light on the topic and an overall approach for you to go and dig into more detail about this for yourself. But our agenda for today, we'll be doing a quick overview of the history of orthorexia nervosa, kind of where that comes from, the development of a diagnostic criteria, recognizing the signs and symptoms, risk factors for onset in terms of what we know right now, treatment strategies that we know of right now, and then we will save some time for questions and answers. Next slide. So here we are going into a brief history of orthorexia nervosa, and you can go to the 4th slide there, Angela. There should be a book on this slide. So orthorexia, and you'll hear me say orthorexia nervosa, orthorexia for short. It was introduced in the late 1990s, around 1997, by Dr. Stephen Brotman, and he published a book a little bit later in 2000, along with David Knight, called Orthorexia Nervosa: Overcoming the Obsession with Healthy Eating. And I find this really interesting. I want to read a snippet from the first paragraph in his intro into this book. So I'm going to read this to you briefly. I promise I won't be reading to you the whole time throughout this presentation. But Brotman says, healing through nutrition is one of the pillars of alternative medicine. Quote, let your food be your medicine, unquote, the saying goes. During my years of medical practice, patients have often begun their conversation with me by asking whether they had been cured, they can be cured through diet. I feel obliged to nod wisely. Although I'm conventionally trained MD, I've been involved with alternative medicine since long before medical school, and a sacred reverence toward the healing power of diet is part of the job description of holistic physicians like myself. However, I'm no longer the true believer in nutritional medicine I used to be. My own experience, as well as what I've seen happen to many of my patients, has affected me deeply. Too often, I've seen the search for cure through diet become a disease worse than the original problem. And I really think, so that's the end of the quote there from the book. I really think that that last line is probably the most important thing in there. Too often, I've seen the search for cure through diet become a disease worse than the problem. And so what Dr. Brotman essentially was seeing in himself was this kind of obsession with food that felt like it was interfering with his life. And he started to see that among his clients as well, his patients, this unhealthy obsession, this obsession with healthy eating. And I will say just briefly here, in my experience working in higher levels of care, in general, I do think we see, and I think physicians will admit this themselves, but we see a kind of a lack of education regarding eating disorders in particular within the basic education in health fields. Like medical doctors will tell you themselves that they have very little training in eating disorders. And so, I hope that over time people become more aware of the basics of eating disorders, including risk factors for orthorexia nervosa. But I think Dr. Brotman is just highlighting that a little bit, that over his own experience, it came to his attention, kind of the focus on health can go a little too far at times and what that looks like. So next slide, please. So describing orthorexia. So we'll get to this throughout, but you'll see that there's a lot of debate among what actually orthorexia nervosa is in terms of how we want to define it. But in general, one definition is that it can be described as an excessive preoccupation with healthy or clean eating that is rigid and inflexible and negatively impacts overall health and well-being. So I think it's important to pay attention to those key words that I've kind of underlined and bolded. It's an excessive preoccupation with healthy or clean eating. It's rigid and inflexible. And so often, we'll talk more about this, but often orthorexia can start just by wanting to, quote unquote, be healthier. And then it will lead to much more and can turn into obsessive thinking, compulsive behaviors, and restriction that just continues to further and further escalate. I'm cutting out more and more types of food. And it really shows up again as this rigid and flexible belief and behavior pattern around food, particularly with the need for food to be clean, healthy, or pure. And as most mental health conditions we see, it can be overwhelming. It can consume the person's mind and time. The impacts can vary in terms of the level of severity, but it definitely has potential to worsen mental health, physical health, strain relationships, and make maintaining school, work, or hobbies really difficult. And an example of kind of excessive, because I think it's hard to, that all of this you'll see we'll talk about throughout can really be seen a little bit as, well, it depends on the person, right? But an example of excessive would be, let's say somebody wants to eat organic food. And that is something that to them, they see that as an important facet of their diet. And for them, it goes outside of just wanting to get organic food at the grocery store. It goes to wanting to get organic food from a locally grown farm, and they want to know exactly the history of that farm in terms of pesticides and going back 5 years. Was there pesticides on this farm, and could that be impacting the food that's grown there today? So it goes down this path of, like I'm saying, extremely and excessive preoccupation. It's really important to know here, I don't know that many individuals realize this, but orthorexia actually is not yet recognized in the DSM. And so it's not something that we currently have, and we'll talk more about that throughout the presentation. But we have limited information on, you might wonder, why is it not in there yet, or what's going on? Because it sounds like we've been talking about it for a while. But when you think about it, Brotman coined this term back in 1997. He wrote that book with Knight in 2000. To my understanding and knowledge, the first research study was done in Europe in 2004. The first study in the US on orthorexia wasn't done until 2013, I believe, around there. So when you think about that and the context of it, it's relatively new, right? And so there's still a lot of research to be done in terms of defining it. Next slide, please. So we're going to look a little bit at where we're at so far in terms of developing diagnostic criteria. And you can go ahead and go to the next slide, Angela, slide 7. So as I was talking at the beginning about orthorexia and giving a quick snippet into how we define it, you can see how there might be a discussion around, well, wait a second, isn't this just OCD? Or isn't this just an already kind of defined eating disorder? Or do we really need to establish orthorexia as kind of its own thing? And so that is part of the debate here. And just for all of us, I know we all come from different backgrounds, but thinking about OCD, it's comprised of obsessions, compulsions, or both. And obsessions, right, are these recurrent, persistent thoughts, urges, or impulses. They're often experienced at some point as intrusive, unwanted, and for most folks, it's going to cause, a lot of anxiety or distress. And so you could see how, there's definitely an element of OCD kind of underpinning within orthorexia. And some folks would argue that orthorexia more falls under OCD than anything else. And then we also have eating disorders. Oh, I should say before I move on, just in terms of prevalence and looking at OCD, the lifetime prevalence of OCD among US adults recently it has been estimated to be about 2.3% of the population. And then for eating disorders, those of you on here might be really familiar with them. You might not be that familiar, but in general, eating disorders are a serious, chronic illness. It greatly impacts the person's mental and physical health and quality of life. And most folks with an eating disorder are really experiencing a lot of distress related to either and or all of this, food intake, body image, or weight. And so some of the eating disorders you're probably most familiar with are anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa. I think some of the more uncommon eating disorders are binge eating disorder, which is the newest eating disorder recognized in the DSM. We also have ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, and OSFED, which for lack of a better term is kind of like a catch-all right now for things that don't quite fit into these other categories. Between 2018 to 2019, nearly 2 out of 100 people in the US were living with an eating disorder. Looking at lifetime prevalence, nearly 1 in 10 females, and which is about 9%, and 1 in 20 males, which is about 4%, will have an eating disorder during their lifetime. And because of my background, I would say that I tend to lean more towards this feels like it falls under eating disorders. So I'll give a disclosure from my lens. That's kind of how I tend to see it. But there is a little bit of a debate going on there. And so we've been doing research over time. And Angela, you can go to the next slide, slide 8 here. Of a recent study that I think is really helpful when we're trying to conceptualize, okay, well, what exactly is this? Where are we drawing the lines? There was a Delphi study done in 2022, and it was basically a systematic way to look at the definition of orthorexia and how we want to define that. And so what this study did was it gathered 47 eating disorder experts from 14 different countries across 4 different continents. And these experts were both eating disorder researchers and multidisciplinary treatment specialists. So quite an array of folks coming to contribute to the conversation. And the Delphi study is a 3-phase model. And in the first phase, what they did was they kind of an operating board kind of developed 67 statements that went into 5 different categories: definition, clinical aspects, duration, consequences, onset, exclusion criteria. So they had 67 statements, and they submitted these statements in writing to that panel of 47 experts, and they asked all of them to identify if they agree or disagree with each statement and then provide a rationale. And then in phase 2, they look at the feedback that they got from phase 1, and they found that about 34 of the statements met or exceeded a consensus of 75% or more of the participants agreeing in those statements. And they gave another opportunity to provide more feedback. And then they got to phase 3. And finally, phase 3, they determined 27 statements that everyone could agree, at least not everyone, 75% of folks could agree were in line with their research, their experience, working with patients directly, et cetera. And so again, this was done in 2022. To me, I think it's impressive the vastness, right, of individuals that they brought into the conversation. And so this is kind of the study that I used as my underpinning for this presentation in terms of looking at how we're talking about orthorexia. Okay, next slide here. We're going to go into the signs and symptoms that we often see with orthorexia. Again, kind of taken a little bit from that 2022 study. And Angela, you can go to slide 10. What the 47 experts in that study decided on is that typically for at least 6 months, again, individuals are going to have an obsessive focus on achieving optimal health by eating the right foods. And what are the right foods? Well, the 47 colleagues said it can be identified as pure, clean, organic, safe, or natural. And so often you might see folks with orthorexia avoiding things like processed foods, artificial colorings, artificial flavorings, things like that. And then, so those are the things that they're going to, they might avoid. And then they may pursue things like organic, whole foods, etc. Often, again, there's going to be this preoccupation with food. It's going to be inflexible food rules, and there's going to be some compulsive behaviors related to it. And so, I think something that's important to highlight here is, again, we'll talk more about this later on, but there's not necessarily a focus on weight loss like we might see with anorexia or bulimia or keeping a thin body. It's going to be more, again, related to the quality of the food. And I think where this can easily become obsessive is that we can't ever fully control what we're consuming. We can't control where it comes from, how it's transported, how it's prepared, etc. At least the vast majority of us are not able to do that, right? And so there's kind of this lack of control combined with this quest for perfectionistic eating and pure eating. And so you can see how that would cause a great deal of suffering. So for example, someone with orthorexia may choose to eat only raw foods because they believe those are the most healthy or pure foods. And this fixation can cause stress, let's say, in a social gathering when their preferred food isn't present. They may avoid, let's say, dinners with colleagues or opportunities to go to coffee with a friend or lunch with a friend, etc. We often see that they can spend an excessive amount of time thinking about food, preparing their food, shopping for food, and all of that stuff can also cut into their time spent at school, work, in hobbies and relationships, etc. I think those are the main points I wanted to focus on here. So we can go on to the next slide, slide 7. So some of the signs, again, extreme food restriction. You might cut out entire food groups because they are unclean, unsafe, or toxic. We kind of talked about that, things with additives, and taking an excessive amount of time to order, shop, prepare for foods, etc. Being preoccupied with food. And that preoccupation, right, it's kind of like, well, what does that mean? How much of their day are they really spending on food? We'll talk more later on about some of the scales that are developed, but what I've seen, it's generally considered more than 3 hours a day people are thinking about, food, and that's taking up a large percent of their cognitive functioning. And again, avoiding social gatherings or settings that involve food, like a work party, holiday potlucks, etc. And then emotional distress or anxiety if they're confronted with food that they believe to be bad or unhealthy, and that they fear might result in negative consequences of their health. And then a lot of feelings of guilt too, feelings of guilt in terms of not being able to eat healthy, if they're not able to eat what they determine to be healthy. And, folks with orthorexia may or may not be able to see that their behavior is distressing or is causing some impairment. I'll say that oftentimes at higher levels of care, people are at a point where a loved one has pointed it out, or they themselves have pointed it out, and they're at a point where they are able to recognize this is having a significant impact. But people who aren't in higher level of care, who aren't seeking treatment, are likely going about things, without really fully recognizing what's going on. There's something else I feel like I wanted to add in here about this. Some of the dialogue I've seen around orthorexia is kind of this almost moral or spiritual feeling around it. Like, It's kind of almost this feeling of, because I'm able to stick to these healthy, pure, clean foods in a way that makes me elevated, that gives me value, right? And so that's a really interesting part of the conversation as well. And again, having less to do with maybe being in a thin body and more to do with just that quality of the food that they're consuming. Okay, going on to slide 12 here, next slide. There are some exclusions that the 2022 study pointed out, and I'm finding this is in line with some of the other research and opinions that I'm running across. So something that's important to consider is that orthorexia nervosa is not going to be, the behaviors are not going to be attributed to a clinical or dietary prescription. So think about, someone may avoid gluten or dairy because they do truly have an allergy to those things. And so their medical providers of dietitians are saying, you're going to want to avoid these things. That's understandable. That is not a cause for someone to be diagnosed with orthorexia. There's also, sometimes doctors may recommend, hey, you might want to cut back on X, Y, and Z because of these medical concerns you're having, and we'll see if that might improve. But for folks with orthorexia, they're going far beyond what a doctor or a medical provider is going to be recommending to them. And then, like most other things, other eating disorders in the DSM, the concerns are not going to be a result of economic conditions, lack of access to certain foods or anything like that, or a specific cultural practices, etc. Again, I will say just briefly in here that the conversation with physicians and sometimes people taking things a little too far does get really muddy. And I think especially when we have physicians that are maybe not thinking about in the lens of, is someone perhaps in a position of being predisposed to developing an eating disorder or orthorexia, may not hold the conversation as delicately or have that lens of looking out for this. So just important to acknowledge that, I think. Okay, going on to the next slide here, slide 13. We kind of have already talked about this, but I really want to drive home the impacts of orthorexia. And I think why this is important is it helps us determine when is it crossing that line. Something that I want to make sure I'm voicing here is, I'm not trying to say that eating healthy in itself, eating healthy, if you're on that pursuit, is bad, right? If for you, you're saying, well, I want to eat this way or that way because it makes me feel better in my body. I'm not saying that that's inherently pathological, but what I am saying is that when we get to a point where it's excessive, right, compulsive, it's interfering with our life and our well-being, that is when we need to be concerned, like most other things, right, that folks might come to us seeking help for. So what are some of the impacts? I think just this overall functioning, right? Maybe difficulty maintaining school or work, relationships, and some of the things that might impact that are just cognitive. Orthorexia is very restrictive, although it's not, people argue it's separate from anorexia. There is this restriction, right, of cutting out maybe specific foods or food groups. And that in itself can increase the risk of someone being malnourished. And so that definitely can, relate to just your overall physical well-being and including your cognitive functioning. But outside of that, also, there's, again, this intense focus on eating healthy and making sure, am I going to have time to go to the grocery store to get XYZ, or what am I going to do about that invite I got to the work dinner? And thinking about that, oftentimes taking up 3 hours or more of your day. So that is a major impact. Also, this emotional impact, again, what's characteristic is we see this excessive guilt or shame. And again, sometimes I think there's still more research needed, but I'm seeing this conversation around, it's almost this spiritual like excessive guilt or shame, like I am a bad person because I have done this, because I have not been able to follow my diet today, or I ate something that was out of what I deem to be my rule and as appropriate for me to eat. And then again, biological, I think it's really important to remember how deadly eating disorders can be. They are a very, very serious illness. And I'm going ahead and grouping orthorexia with eating disorders in my mind. And again, because we see this similarity to other eating disorders like anorexia, where we're cutting out these foods, there might be this nutritional deficiency. Sometimes we can see really low body weight in folks with orthorexia. And it's not necessarily that they're seeking a low body weight, but it might more so just be the result of their pattern of eating. As a result of restriction, you can also see hormonal imbalances. You can see gastrointestinal issues. When you're eating very minimal amount of food, your body responds by kind of slowing things down. Number one, you might not, your body might be conserving energy, but also if you're not getting in adequate nutrition, your gastrointestinal system kind of starts to shut down as well. So we can just see a lot of different issues across different parts of the body. And it can be really concerning, including heart concerns, And then again, I think that social avoidance or isolation is a main impact when it starts interfering with one's ability to engage and keep up those relationships with family and friends. That's a concern often for them, that they might be able to see that this is getting in the way of their overall life. Next slide here on slide 14. So some of the distinctions that the 2022 study referenced and that I've seen in other places, again, I've mentioned this a little bit already, but when we look at trying to weed out anorexia and bulimia specifically from orthorexia, again, anorexia and bulimia are always focused on concern about body weight or size, right? And so there's often this concern, and with anorexia, this excessive, fear of gaining weight. While orthorexia, again, doesn't always require this. So that's not always something that's going to be of concern to someone with orthorexia. It's important to note that those with anorexia or bulimia may or may not develop concerns around clean eating. So it could be something that's presented within their disorder. And we do see that often. And then when we look at avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, so ARFID, which we talked about at the beginning, as a reminder, ARFID is more about sensory sensitivity. So I can't stand things that are mushy. I can't eat that. I'm going to avoid that. Or fear of adverse consequences. And I think a really common example is maybe a fear of choking. Or sometimes ARFID is just this lack of interest in eating in general. Kind of like, if you don't remind me, I'm just going to totally forget about it. It's not something, it's more of a chore for me than anything else. I've heard folks with ARFID say, I wish I could just take a pill every day that would give me all my needs and meet what I need in terms of eating. And I would be perfectly fine with that. So again, orthorexia it's not sensory sensitivity. It's not lack of interest, obviously. It's not the fear of choking. It really is limited only to concerns of clean, healthy eating, pure eating. And then obsessive compulsive disorder, we talked a little bit about this already, but obviously OCD can span a wide variety of concerns, while orthorexia is really limited to just concerns about healthy eating and eating behaviors. Okay, next slide, please, Angela, slide 15. So here are some of the screening tools that have been developed by folks within the field. Although I want to point out that we need more research. This is why it's in its own little standalone box here. And clinicians should not be using this to diagnose or make treatment decisions solely on any of these one screening tools. But I do just want you to be aware that they exist. The Ortho 15, this is a survey that can be used to identify symptoms associated with orthorexia. There is a lot of criticism around this, though. Often what we're seeing is that the screening tool is unable to differentiate between people who have disordered eating and people who have culturally related eating behaviors. And so, I've heard people say, well, based on this, like 50% of the population has orthorexia. So there's some criticism regarding it. It yields different results across different populations. But if you look at it, if you Google Ortho 15, it's helpful just to see what they're screening for there. So what it is having people mark either always, often, sometimes, or never. And here's some examples of the questions. When eating, do you pay attention to the calories of the food? When you go in a food shop, do you feel confused? Are your eating choices conditioned by your worry about your health status? Does the thought about food worry you for more than 3 hours a day? Do you think that the conviction to eat only healthy food increases your self-esteem? And do you feel guilty when transgressing? Again, I think that word transgressing is so interesting. Below that, there has been a slightly updated version to the Ortho 15. That's the, Ortho R, very similar in terms of just the always, often, sometimes, or never, and various questions. Below that, we have the Brotman orthorexia test. And of course, this was developed by Stephen Brotman, who I talked about at the very beginning, who's known for kind of coining the term. And this is a binary yes or no survey that kind of looks at beliefs and thought patterns and behaviors around eating. It's not used as commonly as the ortho. And again, there's also some criticism of this as well, of this test. But again, we have, do you spend 3 or more hours a day thinking about your diet? Do you plan your meals several days in ahead? Is the nutrition value of your meal more important than the pleasure of eating it? That's an interesting one that I don't think I've really brought up. Is the nutritional value of your meal more important than the pleasure of eating it? So kind of with orthorexia, there's not really usually a lot of pleasure in enjoying meals. And that's kind of, it's just purely about the quality of the food you're putting in your body. Another question, has the quality of your life has the quality of your life decreased as the quality of your diet has increased? Have you become stricter with yourself, etc.? There's more questions on there. The last question on it is, do you feel at peace with yourself and in total control when you eat healthy? And then lastly, the eating habits questionnaire, which some of you're probably familiar with this already. This was developed to assess eating behavior patterns just in general, so not specifically geared toward orthorexia. And this is a 21 question questionnaire, and it just helps providers measure, positive or negative feelings around eating, and the amount of nutrition-specific knowledge that their patient has. So again, this kind of looks at 4 different specific categories: healthy eating cognitions, dietary restriction, diet superiority, and social impairment. It's a really helpful questionnaire for overall concerns regarding disordered eating or eating disorders and wanting to look at that. But again, we need more improvements to be able to make this test reliable towards screening for orthorexia. Okay, next slide, please. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to try to go through these next ones quickly. Let's go to slide 17, Angela. The risk factors for orthorexia. A big one that we see is a previous history of eating disorders or disordered eating for the individual. So it's not uncommon for someone to have had maybe anorexia. And then sometimes what we see is their anorexia can be kind of strung along by orthorexia and just justified in a different way by, well, I'm not concerned about my weight anymore, but I really do want to eat healthy. And so there's oftentimes we do see kind of a previous history of eating disorders. There can be a family history of disordered eating or eating disorders. Often too, it's important that we note chronic illness, concerns about health. You could easily see how this could happen. Someone goes to their doctor and their doctor says, you might need to, be careful of eating sugar or whatever it is. And someone predisposed for orthorexia could just take that and run with it 100 miles an hour. So that can be a risk factor. Just this perfectionism as someone's temperament and personality, this need of control, low self-evaluation, self-criticism, tendency to impose excessively high standards on oneself. And then also a history of obsessive compulsive disorder can play a factor. There's other things as well that I've seen in the research, like such as competitive athletes, studying or working in the fitness or health industry, and then having a vegan or vegetarian diet. And lastly, on this slide, we're going to talk about this over the next couple slides, but diet culture and healthism, and folks with orthorexia that are predisposed to it often have an excessive, influence. They might have an excessive influence by media or online content featuring things about diet culture, healthism. So next slide, Angela, slide 18. For those of you who are not familiar very much with diet culture and healthism, in general, diet culture is a system of beliefs and expectations that values thinness above all. So on that picture on the left-hand side, you'll see thinness equals health. Oftentimes in diet culture, it equates having a thin body as being healthy, and consequently assumes that people in larger bodies are unhealthy, and kind of puts this pursuit of thinness on a moral pedestal. And so some of the common themes we see in diet culture is, good versus bad food, and kind of often putting a moral value on food. Deeming that some people are more worthy or less worthy based on their body size, and often seeing movement or exercise as a punishment for compensating for eating or being in a larger body. Again, just promoting excessive exercise often. And then healthism, kind of where that fits in, is kind of more of an attitude and belief that health is the most important pursuit in life, and that one's health is their sole personal responsibility and within their sole control. So not really taking into account the various things that impact our health, and from a systemic lens, and really looking at it as this is the sole person's responsibility and fault, right? Next slide, please, slide 19. So we could have a whole other hour-long presentation just on diet culture and healthism. Again, some of you are probably already familiar with these concepts, but if you're not, I just wanted to flag some resources. And so, like Angela mentioned, you can get a copy of the slides within our platform here. But some books that I might recommend are Anti-Diet by Christy Harrison, who's a registered dietitian, and talking kind of about why diets don't work, kind of the history of diet culture specifically within the US, and focusing on more of an intuitive eating lens, which is often where we go when we're kind of trying to sort of recover from those diet culture kind of impacts. Maintenance Phase is an incredible podcast that talks about these issues. The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor kind of looks at some of the more social justice aspects of this conversation, and when it comes to race, and looking at all of the ways that that people who are not white might experience this in their lives. Fearing the Black body is another one that kind of talks about that conversation. And then the National Alliance for Eating Disorders is a really great national nonprofit that you can go to for learning opportunities. I encourage you to check out their website and just see what's there. And then lastly, Eating Recovery Center, which is a national treatment center for eating disorders, has something called That's Not Normal, a Weight Stigma Unlearning series. And so I invite you to check that out as well. Next slide, Angela, we're going to go into treatment strategies quickly. If you can go to slide 21, Angela, it has that multidisciplinary approach there. So for the treatment in general, again, it's important to note that we need more research to really nail down. There's not there's not a treatment strategy that we have a ton of research on, but if we're looking at it from an eating disorder lens, here's the approach that we would take. And it's important to consider having a team of folks, right? If you're a mental health therapist on this call, it's important to look at maybe getting a medical provider on board to look at those co-occurring or consequent physical health concerns, at least doing some check-ins with a PCP, and hope, most ideally someone who's familiar with eating disorders. Also a registered dietitian, because this is so focused on food, it can be really helpful to have a registered dietitian come in to provide some nutrition counseling and education, and to kind of break down some of the myths around food and eating that folks may have absorbed online, maybe some misinformation, to kind of help break down some of that. Of course, a psychiatrist, if medication would be helpful, mental health therapist like yourself, and then social supports, caregivers, family and friends can also be part of this. So next slide, Angela, slide 22. When it comes to the mental health therapist role, these are some of the approaches that might be helpful for someone with orthorexia. And of course, we want it to be individualized. Not all of these methods are going to be helpful for every single person. But we do see that, cognitive behavioral therapy can be helpful. Most of you are probably very familiar with that. Acceptance and commitment therapy, especially looking at values and, okay, what is it outside of what has orthorexia kind of taken away from you? Some of those impacts again, and how are those tied to your values, and how can we use those values and a focus on that to kind of reconnect you to having a full life connected to the things you care most about, and kind of that can sort of help minimize a little bit the focus on eating. Exposure response prevention, of course, as is in common with obsessive compulsive disorder, cognitive processing therapy, dialectical behavior therapy. All of these things, if you're not familiar with these approaches, I encourage you to look into. I'm a really big fan of ACT and DBT. And then lastly, emotion-focused family therapy can be really helpful if we are going to be able to include family support in the process. As with everything, it's, again, we want to look at what's going to be the most helpful for this individual. What are they coming to us most concerned about, and which one of these models can kind of best support that. When we look at recovery for orthorexia, I want to leave you with this. I think, to me, the words that come to mind are flexibility, balance, variety, right? I'm not trying to tell someone that a concern about eating healthy is always pathological or inherently bad. And when it becomes really compulsive, inflexible, interrupting your life, that's often when people are coming to me and saying, I want to look at this. And often when we're looking at recovery, it's, again, having that flexibility to go to the work party and not be worried about the food that's going to be there, having balance in food and variety so that we're getting all of our nutritional needs met. Those are the main concerns that we're working toward, right? So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and close us up. I think Angela has something she wants to present on Notes, and then I know we also want to have some time for questions.
We can go ahead and take questions now. So please put your questions in the chat box.
And while you're doing that, I want to thank you for taking the time to come and listen to me. I hope this was helpful for you. I'll have my eye in the chat here to see what's coming up. So I'm seeing quite a few questions about just the certificate. I think you can email Angela. She's got her email address in the chat box there. What research do I feel is most necessary right now? That's a good question. I mean, I think the closer we can get into coming up with a consensus to get this, honestly, in the DSM, I think would be helpful so that we're all looking at basically the same diagnostic criteria, the same definition, so we can all get on the same page and then be able to develop those best practices. So I think that's the main concern right now is what research do we need to do really to reach that consensus and to be able to kind of be all on the same page. I will say I'm not an expert in research. So, I would love to talk to someone who's done a lot of extensive research on this about where they're seeing the most need to get to that point. But I think that's a big barrier for us, right? If we're all kind of going, well, I think it's OCD and I think it's an eating disorder and I think it's that, which is understandable, but I think that just causes a lot of confusion and difficulty nailing down how we're going to help people and what the best practices are. And Carolyn just says, the presentation has been fascinating. I'm so glad. Thank you. And then just not a question, but an observation. It would be interesting to take, let's see, a socioeconomic class into account when considering orthorexia. Strict food budgeting can sometimes look like restrictive eating, but the purpose of the restriction is important. Yes, exactly. And that's where I didn't spend a ton of time on that. But when we look at kind of what is going to disqualify someone from being within this category, part of it is that socioeconomic concern. If someone is restricting because they don't have access to food or don't have access to certain types of food, yes, that is not something that we're going to consider orthorexia or part of an eating disorder. And so it is really important to consider. And what's behind the restriction is important. And I think that's where some of those questionnaires come in hand, right? Is getting curious about, okay, what's really going on here? And you can kind of quickly identify what is a concern about quality of food or wanting to be thin or et cetera, versus what is just lack of availability. Yes. Oh my goodness. Darlene put in the chat, I wonder whether the prevalence is greater in some areas rather than others. Thanks for this. Had a friend who died eating raw foods only. So I appreciate this information. Yeah. And I'm sorry for your loss, Darlene. Truly. I think that's one of the reasons I'm really passionate about this topic, because with the lack of awareness, that's part of the diet culture thing, which if we had a ton of time, I would dive more into. But in the US, at least, our culture definitely praises the thin ideal and being healthy. And so sometimes this can just go under the radar. A physician might see that someone has lost a little bit of weight or is excluding XYZ. And in that physician's mind, they're like, oh, good, they're concerned about their health. The physician might praise them. People around them are praising them. Maybe their algorithm on social media is very much geared toward healthism and diet culture, and very easily they can just fall under the radar. And again, oftentimes these folks might not always be fully aware of the distress or impairment that it's causing. And because of the restrictive nature of it and all the medical consequences that can occur, it can get scary really fast. And that's why it's important, if you recognize this in one of your patients or clients, to not be accusatory, but get curious. And, if you can, really encourage a check-in with a doctor who's aware of eating disorders. And the National Alliance for Eating Disorders is a place you can go to try to get referrals for medical providers that are kind of more aware of these issues, but also potentially maybe that dietitian, which I recognize there is a lot of privilege that comes with that, right? Of someone being able to afford a therapist and a medical doctor that specializes in this and a dietitian. I'm completely aware of that. So I know some of it might need to be just do what we can, but that's why it's so important to try to have that multidisciplinary approach where we can. Yeah. And then Charity, good to have a name framework for something I'm seeing in my practice. Not often we get to learn more about something that's quite new. Absolutely. Good. Well, I'm glad this was helpful for you. I think my email address is listed in my bio. It's katiebendel.lcsw@gmail.com. And so if you have questions that I'm not able to answer in here, or you just want links to some of the resources I mentioned, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I'm happy to kind of continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Katie. This was a wonderful presentation. So many great comments in the chat regarding the presentation. So thank you again. You always bring us a great one when you come. So thanks everyone for joining. I see emails coming through already requesting the certificate of attendance. So I'll be getting those out on Monday, and you should be receiving the recording this afternoon as well, or Monday morning. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you for watching today. We hope you enjoyed our webinar. At Iconotes, we're passionate about providing mental health professionals like you with the most clinically robust and intuitive mental health care software available. From psychiatrists to therapists, nurse practitioners to social workers, Iconotes offers a comprehensive solution tailored to your practice's needs. With Iconotes, you can write a flawless note in less than 3 minutes, and without typing a single word. Iconotes was designed specifically to help mental health professionals write comprehensive notes quickly. Iconotes also provides a complete practice management solution with user-friendly scheduling, secure document management, HIPAA-compliant messaging, a certified patient portal, and more, so you can spend less time on paperwork and more time helping your patients. Try us free at iconotes.com/try-us.